decided I've been there. I'd like to know when I should do it.
He's the author of a novel about the shootings at Kent State University in 1970, the anniversary of which would have been Friday. And on that note, a belated Happy Horace Mann's birthday to all of you, who was, of course, the first president of Antioch College, same day. Jerry's also a playwright. He has a very successful one-act play about Branch Rickey, the general manager of the Brooklyn Dodgers and the man who broke the color line in Major League Baseball in 1947. I understand he has also a new one-act play about the first doctor in the city of Portsmouth, Thomas Waller, and we're very proud also to have him here this summer, teaching intensive playwright for the Antioch Writers Workshop. So Jerry is obviously a friend, and he's going to tell us a series of strange tales from Southern Ohio. My friend is Dr. Jerry Holt.
Thank you. Thanks, Scott. It's really good to see you all here. You should be out rollerblading or something on a day like this. Thank you so much for coming. I'll try to make this hour worth your while. When I got up and put on my Speaker's Bureau suit this morning, I somehow forgot that in Yellow Springs people prefer to be comfortable, so I think I'll leave my jacket off if that's okay with you. When I come to Yellow Springs, and I get here a couple of times a year, I always feel that very comfortable sense that I think Yellow Springs kind of prides itself on. In another life I've been here before, something like that, and maybe that's what informs my little talk today too. Because another place I've always felt that way about is Portsmouth, Ohio, down on the river, just about 2 hours east of Cincinnati. I actually came to Portsmouth first in 1990, and I want to frame this with a little personal anecdote because I think it helps. I came to Portsmouth in 1990, and I came from a lifetime of living, teaching, and working in Oklahoma. I've been at a university not unlike Shawnee State University in Oklahoma for 22 years. And I had never applied for a job. I don't know exactly what prompted me to answer that advertisement in the Chronicle for this brand new college along the river. I think it was the idea of starting over and doing it better this time or something like that. I don't know what, but amazingly enough, I got an invitation to come to the campus. But when I got off that airplane in Columbus and rented a car, I went, of course, straight down 23 South. And for a guy who comes from a place where everything is flat, I don't feel this way anymore, but on that particular evening, as it got darker and darker, I really felt I was entering mountainous territory, almost strange, kind of scary territory. And I kept driving and driving, and I didn't seem to get to Portsmouth. And ultimately, when I did get there, I did what I think a lot of people do in arriving at Portsmouth. I drove straight through Portsmouth, right across the bridge and into Kentucky, and had to turn around and back. And I found my hotel, the Ramada Inn, and checked in there about 10 o'clock at night, pretty weary. I was very hungry. The restaurant, of course, was closed, but the bar was open, and they said I could get something to eat in there. So I went into the bar and sat down and made my order. There were just a few souls in there. Sitting across the bar was this very well-groomed, dapper, older gent. He had silver mane of hair and a beautiful beard. And people seemed to know him. And they would keep referring to him. I think it's going to ring a bell or two in here someplace. Would keep referring to him as Lash. I kept looking at him, and pretty soon I just finally went over and said, "Is there any possibility that you are the hero of my early 50s Saturday matinee childhood Lash LaRue, the cowboy star? And he said, why, yes, I am. And we fell together like old friends immediately. I bought him a drink. Actually, everybody in the place had been buying him drinks, but we had a nice little conversation. I went on up to my room. I got a good night's sleep and was ready for the committee at 8 o'clock the next morning. When I went out to get on the elevator at 8 o'clock, standing there as the doors opened, in full regalia, was Iron Eyes Cody. Does anybody know him? He was a character actor in Western films, and he was also the Indian who cried the one tear on the old environmental commercial, big commercial. Well, I knew him immediately and said, hello, Iron Eyes. We had a great talk on the way down. I thought, because one of my areas is film history, I thought I must be in some, movie brigadoon here. I was diving onto movie heaven. There were broken down old cowboys all over this place, and only when I got to the interview did I find out that I landed there in the middle of what is called in Portsmouth Roy Rogers Days, which is, Roy was from Portsmouth, Ohio. And once a year, right about the 1st of June, they have some of the old matinee cowboys come in and sign autographs and hang around for 3 days. And that's where I hit Portsmouth. Well, this was charmed. I just loved this. It seemed to be someplace where I ought to be. And I was thrilled when I was actually offered the job. And from the beginning, it seemed like not only I, but my entire family, we were old souls in this place. Another thing happened very quickly that made me somehow even more sure. After we'd been there a couple of weeks, my older son Matt and I went down to a little restaurant there in the historic area, the Boney Fiddle area, to have dinner together. And there was a very nice person waiting on us, a waitress, and I, of course, got to know her. This was the first time I'd met her. And Matt had ordered something with a mountain of French fries on the plate, and he was doing, what we all do with French fries. Sooner or later, he had the ketchup bottle and was giving it that. And I couldn't do anything to help him, but suddenly this waitress materialized. She's kind of an angelic-looking person. And she said to Matt, "Tap it on the 57." She said, right here on the Heinz bottle, these numbers, 57, if you just give a little tap there. And she did. And ketchup flowed forth like lava. I mean, we were astounded. Matt and I both considered this the most significant scientific information we've probably received in our lifetimes. And, we were sitting there in awe of her, and ketchup on these French fries and so forth. And so finally, after I got over it a little bit, I kind of shook my head and said to her, it seems like the Heinz people would want to advertise this. They wanted people to know about this. And she gave us this beatific smile and replied, I never forgot this. Oh, I don't know. Don't you think that life goes better with a little mystery to it? And right then, I realized I'd landed in a kind of place of mystery and erratic wonder for me, and one which I wanted to know more about immediately. And so one of my weekend vocations immediately became driving around the area, reading books about the area, finding out what this place was that I was going to call home. And that led to some very nice things along down the line, because of course Branch Rickey, along with Roy Rogers, is also from Portsmouth, and getting to tell his story for the stage was something wonderful. The play I got to work on recently for the hospital's 200th anniversary there, having to do with Dr. Thomas Waller, turned out to be a very engaging and informative affair as well. But some of it by this point was finding the right place, the right venue for stories that I had uncovered from time to time. One of the things that bothered me a little bit at the start was that Portsmouth, unlike this community, has gone through hard times for so long that some parts of Portsmouth feel about as down as out can get. It's a Rust Belt town in some ways. It used to be about steel and shoes and quite prosperous, but in the 60s those went away, and frankly it's depended a lot upon the university to be this new spiritual and economic center, which is a big load to put on anything. But lots and lots of people in Portsmouth, like other towns that industry has left from time to time, have felt that, well, maybe there's not much of interest here to anybody else. And so I initially met a lot of people who weren't that excited about their own history. But I got pretty excited immediately, because if you stand on the banks of that river, essentially everything happened there. The whole westward movement went by Portsmouth, Ohio. Lewis, Meriwether Lewis, went by there shortly before he met Clark at Cincinnati. Right up the road, down the river, Scott, is of course the town of Ripley, which is a cradle of the Underground Railroad. Uncle Tom's Cabin sets a scene right there at Ripley, where a line crosses the river in the frozen ice. And perhaps most significant to me, Ripley must have been where Huck and Jim were trying to get in Huckleberry Finn, when they get lost in the fog at Cairo, and instead of getting onto the Ohio, go further and further down the Mississippi. It's a cradle of amazing and exciting things. And the more I began to research Portsmouth, the more I became very, very glad that I lived there. I got a few strange stories for you. Some of these stories have interesting endings yet to be written. And I had such a nice time last year when I came over here. I kind of went through and picked out 3 or 4 that I thought would be maybe of particular interest to you all, so I hope I did right. The first one I'd like to tell you about is the story of a man named Josiah Shackford, who is known as one of the founders of Portsmouth, along with Henry Massey and Thomas Waller and some of the other people who came my way while I was writing that play. But Shackford is a particularly interesting case, I think. Some say he may have named the town because he came there from Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And that seems like a possibility. It seems logical. But he came there kind of in a snit. He had just split up with his wife. She would not leave her aged mother to go with him down the river. And you get an idea that one of the reasons he wanted her to go was to get away from the aged mother to start with. But he wound up in Portsmouth wifeless, and evidently with a real anger, believe it or not at this point, toward all women. He was looking for a place to dwell which had no women, which is, it's problematic that he stopped in Portsmouth, because there were certainly women there by this point. But he set about being a good founder, clearing the land, and building himself a house right down on Front Street by the river. That house he built, very few people ever saw the inside of it, but the house he built evidently had a second floor that you entered as you might a ship by pulling up stairs after you. And the few that saw it said it was decked out like a ship's cabin up there. Although he wanted nothing to do with women, he did hire one, poor Mrs. John Thornton, who had the unhappy duty twice a day of bringing him meals, which she put on a tray and then pulled up to the second floor, where he took them like that. A real eccentric who lived into his 90s and is the second person buried in the Green Lawn Cemetery there, and it's called kind of grudgingly or embarrassingly a founder because he has such strange ideas. That's generally well known in Portsmouth. Here is something that wasn't well known. One day, when I finished teaching class, I mentioned something earlier in the week about Shackford. A student brought me something that he had gotten, of all things, out of one of those magazines that they put on the airline. And the airline magazine had a story about Josiah Shackford. Didn't have anything to do with Portsmouth. Didn't even mention that he went up in Portsmouth. It had to do with his career in the 1790s. In the 1790s, Josiah Shackford, the same one, and this makes sense, was making his living delivering boats. He'd take a boat here for somebody, they'd give him another boat, he'd take another one, and if the boat was big enough, they gave him a crew to go with him. Well, the article referred to a time in 1793 when Shackford had been commissioned with a crew to take a boat from Suriname, South America, to Bordeaux, France. And once he got to Bordeaux, they thought he did such a good job that they gave him another boat and a small crew to take back. If you're a seagoing person or interested in boats, I even have the specifications here. This was a sloop, fair-sized boat, would have measured around 35 feet by 11 by 6, probably would have had a short bowsprit, but not a topmast. And it needed a crew. Well, he got out a little bag, and the crew evidently decided what you have probably already suspected about Shackford, that he was nuts. And they didn't want anything else to do with him. Well, Shackford said, "That's fine. I will put you off in Benin, and I will continue." And so the crew left, leaving him alone. He continued the journey. Well, he had one companion, a dog. But otherwise, he was doing it by himself. Now, listen to this. This is pretty amazing stuff. 35 days later, averaging 100 miles a day, man and dog completed the trek to Suriname. 3,700 miles. I don't know if you can see that, but there it is. When he got there, the folks in Suriname thought this couldn't have happened. He must have done this with a crew to right up here where maybe he went amok and axed them all up and threw them overboard or something like that. They made him go out again a ways to show he could do it by himself. If this is correct, if the article is correct, now mention this, that's languishing there. That makes Josiah Shackford, my own Josiah Shackford from Portsmouth, Ohio, the first recorded human being to cross an ocean by himself. You might think that's not giving the dog enough credit. There you are. Well, every time I came on one of these stories when I first got here, when my kids were much younger, I'd grab a kid, and tell the story immediately. And this is what I told to my son Pike. And Pike thought about this, and he helped me with this map. We looked at the map. He said, "Dad, you know what that means?" About 10 times what? It means that Portsmouth has its own Christopher Columbus. And yet, the Josiah Shackford bed and board is not in the Boneyfiddle district. There's no such place. The replica of this boat, because that's pretty exciting stuff, has not been created there. In other words, the community is missing out on a resource because it hasn't looked at the rest of the story. But that's a very compelling one. I'll tell you another one. I think part of the story is a little bit scary and, frankly, a little bit making, but this is the viewer discretion advised part, I guess. But it has an ending that has not yet been written. So this is a story in two parts. It's a compelling historic story, and it's a detective story as well. And this is the one I thought you all might really particularly like. In Portsmouth, you can go in, again, that historical district, and buy a very small book. I mean, a physically small book, one of those little baby books, which is purported to be the diary of a woman named Phoebe Chaffin Saladay. Phoebe Chaffin Saladay was a contemporary of Josiah Shackford's and one of the first remembered women settlers in the area. This is supposedly a diary that she wrote beginning in 1810 and which continued throughout her life. And I was given a copy of this diary and I read it with great interest. It was just fascinating. And I also checked it against the historical record in Portsmouth Wonderful Historical Room, the library, and found that everything in the diary is on the level. It's all fact. And the diary was great fun to read. Let me read you just a couple of quick sections. This is about a woman who comes from Connecticut with her family, settles, she's 15 years old when she gets there. She settles, Mr. Shackford did, but she settles with her family. And she's going to fall in love with a man named Saladay, George Saladay. She's going to get married and she's going to, rear her own children there. But she tells the story in this diary, February 19th, 1810. This is a lovely country, although it causes me to be sad when I think of the old friends we have left behind in Connecticut. I'm homesick for the sight of the sea and long again to hear the breakers rolling along the shore. This river, the Ohio, or beautiful river as the Indians call it, slips silently away to the sea with no more fuss or noise than the mild white caps breaking the surface of the brown breast of the stream. She's right, can't she? There are so few of us, mostly French settlers who live near us since we live on what is known as the French Grant. It is indeed fun to hear them run on in their strange language. After the last cabin raising, the Chabots did have a dance for us young people and entertained us well. I did not sit out one dance and was fair worn out when the evening was over. There was a strange young man there by the name of George Saladay, a guest at the Chabots. 3 times he asked me the pleasure of my hand at the reels, and proud I was to be seen with him. He told me he was late from the state of Maryland and that his parents came from the old country of Switzerland. Diary, I tell no one else but you. Would that I might meet him again. My heart beats pleasurably at the thought. But now to the kitchen about soap making today. By nightfall, my hands will be so rough and red, and I can no longer hold this pen I now grasp so tightly. Beautiful hands, so George Saladay thinks. I had no right to let him say so bold a thing, did I, diary? So she's falling in love here. And she's falling in love at an amazing and strange time. George Saladay would be with his father, this is fact, when they saw the last buffalo anybody saw in Scioto County. As a matter of fact, Dad shot it. It was charging them. They lived in a land where parakeet were still so plentiful that they could darken the sky and make you think it was night at times. They lived in a land where mosquitoes could be so inhospitable toward one and all that everybody thought about packing up and leaving from time to time. And most of all, they lived in a place where it flooded all the time, because Portsmouth was not yet Portsmouth. It was Alexandria, which is now West Portsmouth. And over there, on that floodplain, people got flooded out every few years. After a while, it became a kind of community enterprise to get people to move over to the other side, what is now Portsmouth, which finally, a significant number of people did. And Phoebe Chaffin, soon to become Saladay, was caught up in all of that. At another point in the diary, after she and George are just married, she says, already George loves this wild Ohio that I feel I can never really care for. He hopes someday that Portsmouth, a little village near us, will be a large town with many people. Several years ago, when he was about 18, he helped Captain Josiah Shackford and Major Henry Massey clear the first brush piles and fell the huge trees to the few houses that would be the settlement of Portsmouth. It is called that because the meandering Scioto River empties into the Ohio at that very point, hence the name Portsmouth. There's another explanation for the name. Its name makes me fair homesick for the city of Portsmouth, New Hampshire, where I've often visited my aunts and cousins. I laugh when I think of that great, flourishing city as compared with the few small log houses and stores of its namesake town, Ohio. It'll take a lot of settlers to make it a rival city. At first, the town was laid out on the other side of the Scioto, but after the floods destroyed it twice, it was decided to change the site to the higher banks of the river. They also changed its name from Alexandria to Portsmouth. no helping to change its luck. Well, they homestead there, George and Phoebe, and George goes to New Orleans a lot, taking goods and selling them and coming back. But they are happy, they have children. Phoebe comes to kind of like the place, and at one point, something befalls them that should never befall anyone. They begin to feel that the family has been hit with a terrible curse. The curse they would have called the disease of consumption. You know, we would call it tuberculosis. And they were absolutely certain that by some edict of God, some family sin, it was taking members of the family one by one. And in fact, 2 brothers of George did die just like that. And then Dad died. They were dropping like flies. The family, thanks to George, who had heard about it in New Orleans, decided to try something extra. They decided to try something George had brought back under the name technique. George had brought back under the name the cure. I'm going to let you use the diary for this. Here's the way the cure is carried out. Poor Samuel Saladay, the last to die, was disinterred and unwrapped from his grave clothes. Then Mr. Wheeler made an incision in the body, removing the heart, liver, lungs, and entrails. The Saladay women were not permitted to watch these gory proceedings, but the Saladay men aided Matt as best they could. A roaring fire had been prepared in the field near the Saladay burying ground on the ridge. When it was at its hottest, the parts of poor Samuel's body which had been removed were cast into the flames. As they began to be consumed, all the Saladay family, together with a few neighbors, gathered around the fire and took deep breaths of the smoke. It is said that this will ward off the dread disease. George and I decided not to bring our 2 babies to the fire as they are seemingly in good health. We will trust the Lord to continue to care for them. I'm ashamed to tell Diary that I behaved quite badly when the smoke began to curl around my face. I did faint dead away, making George very provoked with me until I told him that my illness was of another kind. She's pregnant again. This passage, I think, is really nice writing. The memory of that cheerless autumn day with the dead leaves drifting hither and thither upon the seated assembly and the rancid odor of the flames devouring human flesh will long remain with me. Others of the family did feel the same way. George's aunt, Mrs. Matthew Curran, who was a Saladay, did tell us that she felt faint too after leaving the scene. It's an amazing story of, a repulsive gathering, to say the least, attempting to breathe this smoke created by the entrails. But at the same time, an amazing story of family love and loyalty. These people would do anything at this point to try to save their loved ones. Well, the diary goes on, and it's very, very beautifully written, even at the end, when George and Phoebe do not get consumption, and neither do their kids, and they do survive, and at one point, Phoebe makes the simple entry as an elderly woman. George and I are still married, and still very happy, as if she's updating the world to come, as I suppose diarists always are somewhere or another. But I read this thing, and I thought, God, a lot of this writing is just really good. It bothered me, it bugged me, but I didn't, look into it any further until yet again, one day after class, an older student that I'd had in the class came to me and said, well, my mother is getting ready to move to Hillcrest Retirement Center, and she was cleaning out her house, and she found something which I think you would find interesting. So the next thing I know, the mom came too, and she had a letter. This is the detective story part. I like this one. The letter was written by a woman named Hazel Prince in 1940, at the end of the Depression. Hazel Prince was really in high dudgeon. She was really mad in this letter. The letter talked about, this letter to a friend, and the letter talked about a contest she had entered, sponsored by the Ohio Historical Society, the prize for which was to be $100 cash. The Depression times, she really wanted that $100. And the contest, as you began to decipher it a little bit, had been as follows. If you wanted to enter the contest, you were to take an historic personage from your own community, say Horseman, somebody famous from your community, and to tell a historically accurate story of that person's time and place through the famous person's eyes. Hazel said in her letter, I wrote a really good entry. I know it was a good entry. And all I got was an honorable mention. They said, and this is what she was really angry about, they said if I came to Columbus, I could go to the banquet. And then she said, but Columbus is a long way to go just to eat. Could this be? You know where this is going. Could this be? So, we started calling up there the Historical Society, and we finally found a woman who went back just about that far and has some memory of that particular contest, which was held right there in the last days of the Depression, before World War II. After some digging, she did come up with a bound volume of the entries for that contest. And sure enough, in the honorable mentions, there was Hazel Prince's entry, and it was what is purported to be the Phoebe Chaplin diary. Why did she win? Well, it's written right there on the entry. And this is a really good lesson for composition students, so I'll haul this out sometimes in a composition class. The reason she didn't win was because she failed to document her sources. She had used every book I looked up to double check the diary here. They were common texts. The James Swords book of Portsmouth history, the same stuff you can find in historical record. But she hadn't put the all-important bibliography in there, and they busted her for it. They loved the entry, but she hadn't followed the rules of the contest. They see, there's a whole other story to tell there. Hazel Prince, she could just read this thing, she can write a fallen angel. What happened to her? I know the actress, I know she was living in Portsmouth at the time, because that's on the record. There's someone, I've only found one person who knew her a little. That person says she thinks she moved to Florida. But what happens to someone who can write like this? What's the rest of her life like? I'd love to know. Hope to find out. I just think that's a very charming, fetching story. Okay, well, a couple more. I'll tell you what, let's go to the 20th century and stay with the subject of river and flood, since we've kind of set that up already. 1937, Portsmouth's Great Flood, Portsmouth's Book of Genesis. We have to set that up a little bit, I think, too. 1937, of course, well into the Depression we just mentioned. Why did a flood not seem too strange to the residents of Portsmouth? Well, what could have been strange in the Depression by that time? The country had an economic collapse, 80% unemployment in big cities, bread lines. The only industry that actually seemed to be doing well was the movies, because people still seem to be able to find a dime to go to them. And then out where I live, of course, all sorts of what appeared to be cosmic disasters, the Dust Bowl, the migration to California, and now, of course, the floods along the river. Y'all know, I know you know that Halloween night, 1938, when Orson Welles, you know that story? It's perfect. Orson Welles on the radio with his Mercury players. What's the story of that? He'd been up against forever the competition of Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy. what was Charlie McCarthy? He was a dummy. He was a ventriloquist. I never figured out how that worked on the radio in the front and not see if their lips were. Well, they were funny. And they always beat Orson Welles' highfalutin Mercury Theater out. Halloween night in 1938, he was going to win. So he did Orson Welles' War of the Worlds as if it were a news broadcast. And of course, there was, I've heard the tape has got commercials that, this doesn't fool us today. But I think a lot of it had to do with the way people radio then, because it was you brought a lot more to it to start with. And also somebody yelled across the back fence, hey, turn the dial. I mean, we weren't channel surfing in those days. Turn the dial, something interesting is going on over here. So they came into the middle of it. But it was so compelling that, so a number of people were sure Martians had landed. But put that in a larger context. Why not? Dust Bowl, economic collapse, horrible Noah-like flooding along the river. Why not Martians? Would that be so surprising? The 1930s. Well, anyway, late January, early February was not surprising to Portsmouth. When the rains came and kept coming, and when it became clear that we have to open the floodgates, that's what they did, and the city went underwater and stayed underwater for 2 weeks. I'll show you a few pictures here. The city underwater. These don't have any sound. This is how you went places by boat during those 2 weeks. And there was initially some terror, but then people kind of adjusted. The kids sort of liked it, of course, because there was no school. But in the process, there was millions of dollars worth of damage being done to area businesses. There were touching moments. I know a realtor in Portsmouth right now, a friend of mine named Ruth Ann Brush, who says she wouldn't be here but for the, you can see how high that water went. It wouldn't be here but for the flood. Her father first laid eyes on her mother when he was rowing a boat past her house, and she was sitting on the roof with her dog, and he rescued her, and it was love at first drip, I guess. Otherwise, there would be no Ruth Ann Brush. These are familiar sights to me, except for the fact they're underwater. That's the high school. That's the Portsmouth High School. I looked up. I'm always touched by this kind of thing. I looked up. How cities do every Christmas? They do letters to Santa from the kids. Collect letters to Santa. Letters to Santa, 1937. The Christmas after the flood. Of course, it was still, suffering from depression and still drying out. As a matter of fact, 2 months to dry out. A couple of these letters really got me. Dear Santa, would you bring me a doll with curls just like the one you brought me last year? That doll was drowned in the flood. Please bring me another. Her name was Flo, and I loved her so much. With bushels of love, Frances Carolyn Fain. Dear Santa, we had a hard year with the flood, and now I have the measles. M-E-A-S-O-L-S. I want you to come down our chimney, but I don't want you to get the measles. Could you leave my presents outside? I'm 6 years old, and I printed this letter myself. Goodbye, Mary Catherine Waters. And how about this one? This is a little girl I would like to have met. Dear Santa, I'm a little girl 9 years old and in the 4th grade, and I go to school every day. I would love to have a snowsuit, but my mother's sick all the time, so I don't guess I will get anything unless you remember my letter and leave me some things. I will close with lots of love for you and Mrs. Claus, your little friend Faye Smith. P.S. Please, Santa, do remember my mother who is sick, whether you bring me anything or not. And remember the other poor children. There are so many. Sweet little girl. Well, that town underwater, of course, built up its own mythology from that moment. from a certain generation, from a certain time. I was talking to somebody a while ago who came here and left Portsmouth in 1937. From that particular juncture, everything changed about Portsmouth. Everything is now informed by that flood. Interestingly enough, there was only one fatality in that flood. And now I'll tell you a really remarkable story. I was doing a class called River Studies. We got a little money to do an omnibus class a couple of years ago where scholars from different disciplines just all came in to talk about the river. Geologists and folk people and botanists, historians, anybody who could find who had something to say about the river. I brought them in and they talked. And we had a large group in there because we opened up the course of the community. We had about 150 people. And there were nice sessions every Monday night. And we did a whole section night on the flood where people who had gone through the flood came in and just shared their reminiscences. And I just idly asked on that night, we always hear there was a fatality in the 1937 flood, but it seems to be all we hear. And the next day, those people, the community people were great researchers, and the next day I had the facts on my desk. Woman drowned as boat tips over, first victim. This is written in 37, of course. There wouldn't be any more victims. Listen to this. Mrs. Bessie Tomlin, 22, in the next word, colored, of the rear of 1143 11th Street, an expectant mother, is believed to be Portsmouth's first known victim of the raging floodwaters, hurled into the overflowing stream at 11th and Water Streets when a boat capsized at about 7 p.m. Monday. Mrs. Tomlin gave her life to save her daughter, Alberta, 18 months old. When last seen, Mrs. Tomlin was holding her baby out of the water as a rescuer came near. She disappeared beneath the surface as the infant was lifted from her hands. 6 other occupants of the boat, including Lieutenant Walter Chick of the local fire department, Mrs. Tomlin's 3 children, and her mother-in-law, were rescued. Weighted down by boots and heavy clothing, Fireman Chick aided the occupants of the boat and then swam to a small store where he clung to a second-story window ledge until rescued. That's it. At this point, of course, there's cleanup. At this point, of course, Bessie Tomlin disappears from view. This is not a slam dunk Portsmouth story. It would have been true in any number of cities in 1937. She was black, and she got lost to history. And yet she did something remarkable. Not that any mother wouldn't have done it, not that it was not just an act of mother love or parent love or whatever, but still she was in on a moment in history. As she was drowning, she handed up her 18-month-old daughter, Alberta, into the hands of a white fireman in the boat. Bessie Tomlin, boy, I took a good look at her short and sad life. 22 years of age, pregnant at that time, with 2 other sons and an 18-month-old daughter, wasn't only on the run from the flood on that day. She was on the run from an abusive husband, so well known in town he went by the nickname Trimbletoe, and he was out there waiting for her someplace. If the flood didn't get her, he would. She was in a state of absolute desperation on that day and certainly had no reason to trust any white person. And yet that is who she handed her baby up to. This compelling moment, frozen in time. Well, of course, the class looked at me and I looked at the class, and the same thing occurred to us immediately. She was 18 months old in 1937. Where is Alberta now? Where is Alberta now? She was living about 2 blocks away in Portsmouth's predominantly black community. The story in the black, and Portsmouth's not that big a place, the story in the black community was well known. The story in the white community was not known at all. I called her up. I said, this is an amazing story. And here you are, she's 64 now. I said, how come you've never told the story? Nobody ever asked me, she replied. She's garrulous, a very enchanting woman. That's what she said. That's not what she really meant. What she really meant was nobody white has ever asked me. But the next Monday night, our guest of honor was Alberta Parker. And she came in and she wanted to play. She's raised 5 sons of her own, by the way. And you know how all these stories just keep being about more stories? Well, of course, we asked her a couple of questions about what she knew about her mother. She knew very little, of course. And we asked her what she felt would be a proper monument to her mother. What she said is interesting. We'll get to that in just a second. But we did start wondering immediately about Walter Chick. And as a class, we researched Walter Chick. He was dead. But we found that he had a son who was living in Florida. When the son found out about what had transpired here, he really didn't know anything about his father's practice. When the son found out what had transpired here, he and his wife rerouted a cross-country trip that they were going to take last summer to come through Portsmouth. Something amazing ensued, and I want to show it to you. I'm so pleased about this, and I'm so happy it's you all I'm getting to show it to you. This has got sound.
Three, 4 blocks into town was covered with 3 or 4 stories of water. Now, a young mother, Bessie Tomlin, was thrown from a rescue boat with her 18-month-old daughter, Alberta, still in her arms. Now, as Bessie was being sucked under by the current, she was able to hoist her baby up into the waiting arms of rescue firefighter Walter Chick. However, since the day her mother died, Alberta has wanted to meet the man that saved her life, or at least somebody from that family. That never happened until this week. Ever since she was pulled from her mother's arms,
and that's Dave Chick, the son of
Alberta Parker hoped to meet the Portsmouth firefighter that saved her life. Lieutenant Walter Chick died in 1983, but his son came to Portsmouth this week from Florida. Dave Chick came to embrace the little girl etched in 2 families' memories.
They were trying
That's the only existing portrait of Bessie Tomlin.
And they had her arm, and the current pulled her off of their arm, and Dad reached and grabbed the baby and pulled the baby into the boat. She was holding the baby above her head. He said, and he grabbed the baby and saved the baby.
I thought I could just meet someone of his family. To me, it's just like him still, stew all through the blood. I mean, both when he took his arms. Oh, I hugged and kissed him. I mean, I wasn't thinking, I forgot it. I wasn't thinking about his wife over there, but I'm sure she understood.
He told that we go back a number of years. Former big league baseball great and current community leader Al Oliver wants more than memories for Bessie Tomlin. Oliver is leading a fund drive to replace Tomlin's small cemetery roadside gravestone with a memorial befitting someone who made the ultimate sacrifice.
And here we have a black woman who's reaching her hand out, and here is a white man who's reaching his hand out to help. To me, this is what life is all about.
There are also plans to include the Bessie Tomlin story in a flood wall mural on the 1937 disaster. But Dave Chick and Alberta Parker say their newly forged bond is a picture of fulfillment.
I hope we become like another family.
Special is that. Al Oliver was talking, when he was talking about black and white hands, he was talking about the segregated days of 1937. He said it's come a long way since. And when I talked to Alberta Parker back in November, she had said she wanted to meet somebody from the Chick family. And I hope you saw in the pictures, the emotion today was just, it struck right here in my heart.
There's a nice ending to that story, isn't it? However, it's not quite over yet. When we did, the night we did the Thomas Walton play, we invited Alberta to be a guest of honor and introduced her. I mean, it's just time, to celebrate that story. And in the lobby, when everybody was mingling around afterward, an aged woman approached her and said, I was in the boat next to your mother. I saw your mother hand you up. And that's our next piece of videotape. I mean, that story just keeps happening. Very quickly, I said when Alberta was asked what she might consider a tribute to her mother, I would tell you about that in just a second. She said that it would be nice if she had another headstone, and that's come in quickly. She's going to get that. This Portsmouth. But she also said immediately, and it would be nice if my mother could be on the murals. Now this is a continuing story. There's Robert Dabbert, the murals. This is a continuing story, but one that I hope to come back and tell you about again sometime. In its attempt to rejuvenate itself, one of the things that Portsmouth did was hire a Louisiana muralist, Robert Dafford, to take his flood wall and turn a drawback, because the flood wall keeps you from the view of the river, into an asset. They hired him to create a series of historic murals up and down the flood wall, a half mile. Next summer, imagine this, when he finishes, this will be the longest continuous set of panels in the world. And he has gotten better and better and better at what he does as he's gotten to know us better. And some strange and amazing things have been happening with these murals. As I say, this is a whole other presentation. I'd love to come back and give you some time when the murals are finished, or even better, if you all come to see the murals sometime. He has taken to putting, think of the beauty of this, he has taken to putting the faces of living Portsmouthians anachronistically, into these settings where they don't necessarily belong, into historic scenes, or into the borders of murals. And what is happening there is that we've almost got something going like performance art. No one knows who's next going to turn up in the murals. And the interaction between community and murals is like an unreeling motion picture. Everybody would kind of like to be on there, I think, because after all, it's a form of immortality, isn't it? I mean, those murals are going to be there for a very, very long time. But nobody is quite sure how this works. You would think you could get on there for your good works, but the muralist seems as likely to put a derelict on there as someone for good works. So he's kind of like this Calvinist god up there, kind of deciding who's going to go on the murals. And some things have happened there that are just remarkable. He painted a mural on the back of the new Super Kroger store. They asked him to, and he painted a 1900 circa grocery store. And he took the faces of everybody operating businesses on the other side of the street, and he put them into the 1900 grocery store mural. Now, my wife, Beth, has a business on the other side of the street. So she wound up with her partner looking out a second-story window, so that every day when we go to work now, there's Beth peering down at me out of the second-story window. And I'm knowing more and more people every single day, every single summer, which is when he works. I know more and more people who wind up on the mural. It's really quite a fascinating thing. Let me see real quickly if I can. That's the Civil War mural. Portsmouth had a company in the Civil War. You can see how elaborate some of these things get. There's Julia Marlowe. There's Roy. Branch Rickey. That motorcycle mural is one of the most impressive ones, as a matter of fact. Portsmouth see the people in the margins? That is probably the great blues singer Robert Johnson, who may have visited Portsmouth, evidently. They think they found him in a picture.
Have they agreed to put Bessie in the mural?
Yes, they have. Yes, they have. There is the Kroger mural. These guys run a sign painting business on the other side of the street. If you lived in Portsmouth, in fact, you would know them all. Those are somebody's kids. I don't know who the kids are, but their parents sure know. You can see how this works. This is an extensive thing. It goes on a couple of blocks. There's Beth up there. And her partner, Sue Ellen. So every day, there she appears. Rain, snow, wind, sleet, hail, good weather. All the dramas that are going to come out onto the street out of any Kroger store, all the amazing life's passages that are going to take place underneath this mural. There she is, watching the whole thing for, the foreseeable recorded eternity here. And a lot of other Portsmouth people are going to be doing the very same thing. So it'll be fascinating to see how this all comes out and how much of our history, not only historic history, but our current history, there's her story too, comes through in those murals. I'm out of time here, folks. I got a lot more stories, but I get kind of carried away because I love that place. I love these stories, and y'all are so nice. Thank you very much. Questions, commentary?
Well, I think I found my maybe I'll find the same source here in this area that you found when you moved into Portsmouth.
Good. Where did you come from?
Dayton. But even that noticed the story. I've been a newspaperman for 25 years. So much as I've been disabled and had to go through years of microfilm that I'm really uncovering the stories. And they're the tongue tells. I've been telling people about this tale here about how my son's great-grandfather's best friend organized a militia. Pulled off the only successful defense in the black community against the white lynch mob that involved death or serious property damage. That was 80 years ago, March 11th.
The best way I can think of accessible to those of us who live in communities, smaller communities like these, but maybe the large communities too. I think to give something to our children is to give them a sense of where they lived and what happened there. And I don't see why we don't make more concentrated effort to do genealogy, direct genealogy with students who at very young ages could easily take to it. Why don't we let them ask their grandparents to class? Why don't we get those kinds of exchanges going and we'll let them know where... Do you know very many kids who know their families past their living grandparents? I don't know.
My sons.
Well, you're doing it right. I don't know too many, and every family has fascinating histories to tell. I would love for public school classrooms to do a lot more with local history. I think there's a real salvation for communities like Portsmouth.
Isn't part of the problem, though, that society is so local, that the local community history is not directly tied to the local school kids in terms of the grandparents and parents? It's somebody else's grandparents and parents.
Yeah, that, I still think there's enough there.
Still some of the family that stay with the family. My father's an immigrant from Austria. And those failed to work for us.
And that's
And why did he come to this country?
yeah, the jury of discovery. Who knows where they will lead? Yeah.
I heard about the Portsmouth flood since I was a child, because my mom was in that flood.
I remember that
Yeah.
too.
I was a senior in high school in 1937, and we lived in the lower part. I mean, in Portsmouth, part of it is called the lower part, and the other part is on the hill. And the people living on the hill didn't get the water in their house. We got about 7 or 8 feet in our house. And my parents lived upstairs then. I mean, they just moved upstairs and dug out I guess we must have, a fireplace up there at one time, and they just cooked up there. People came along in boats and threw in milk or bread or, into the window on the second floor. And I went up on the hill and stayed with my French teacher, who offered me to stay with her, and she just rented a room. I stayed there. And most people that were sort of refugees from the flood were in the school buildings, and they were just housed there. And I helped feed them and do whatever people needed to do. My father was called the river observer, so he knew every day he had to measure the river and see how high it was, and so our phone was ringing all the time. He at one time was captain of a wharf boat that was down on the river.
Betsy would have been on her way from Washington School to Lincoln School. And what you just described is exactly right. Washington was down close to where you were. Lincoln was up on the hill. So they were trying to get to the high ground. That's
He
right.
showed a picture of the Henry Massey School where I went, just across the street from the Ramada Inn, where you said you stayed.
That's right.
You stayed.
Absolutely right.
Do you remember the story about Bessie? What was her name?
No, I didn't. I didn't know that story.
It is an astoundingly unknown story, and it is just as compelling as can be. I've been thinking an awful lot lately about things we consider primary texts, or things we all know quite well, that have these untold stories that ought to be told. I don't know what came from. I was reading of Plymouth Plantation, a Bradford thing, and going to Plymouth Rock and so on. And his wife drowns on Christmas Day. There's even, before they get there, there's even some kind of vague implication that she couldn't stand it anymore and committed suicide. Well, she's a voice like Bessie's that we've never heard from. What a story she must have to tell, or have had to tell. How do you get at those stories? Well, Bessie couldn't speak for herself, but thank goodness the daughter was still around. And we found some link there that's now spread through 2 families and is now going to go to another one. So those stories that people that didn't get to tell their own stories, I think, are well worth carrying out. You've probably come across a lot of that, Scott.
Certainly. I have been a newspaper man for a couple of natural disasters here about a lot of especially in the 19th and 20th century, a lot of the communities' collective memory depends upon what gets into the newspaper. Because that's what goes back to, you have the old yellow copies in the shoebox that get pulled out. Everybody remembers the story because they read about it. And back in the 1930s, flood everybody knows about Patterson, because he happened to be right where the railroad ended. The Cincinnati Lebanon Northern went underwater at the NCR plant. That was the only railroad that went north-south on the divide, and it wasn't underwater at the time. So it was also the only railroad that Newsman could get into the interior flood area with. And recently they come out with some compelling stories about what was going on the other side, on the north side of the flood area. There was a guy who had been, apparently he commandeered boats at gunpoint. You saved a great number of people. Kettering and a friend drove for hours trying to get clear to Cox and Columbus. There's a number of other stories that just didn't get put out because all the newsmen were coming down on Cincinnati Lebanon Northern out in NCR where Patterson was trying to arrest Texas history, and he was making it very easy for them to cover the flood from the National Cash Register plant.
Well, I see a groaning table of